Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. This is another webinar presented by the Dairy XNet Group. This is part of the E-Extension. Our topic today is a very timely and important topic, one on avoiding disease in dairy calves. Our speaker today is Dr. Jeff Smith from North Carolina State. Dr. Smith did his undergraduate program in animal and dairy science in Clemson, and then went on and did a master's degree in toxicology at the University of Illinois, and then continued to complete his doctorate of veterinary medicine degree in 1998. Dr. Smith then remained at the University of Illinois for another 4 years while he completed his internship and residency in internal medicine, along with a PhD in physiology. At that point, he moved to North Carolina State University and was added to the faculty in 2002, and currently he is a professor of ruminant medicine in the Department of Population Health and Pathobiology. Jeff is a diplomat of the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine, and his primary clinical and research interests revolve around clinical medicine of ruminants with a specific focus on calf health, which of course is our topic for this morning, or this afternoon. So with that, I'll go ahead and let Jeff go ahead and start the program. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Van Saun. It's my pleasure to talk with you all this afternoon. So we're going to talk for about 20 or 25 minutes on avoiding disease in dairy calves, which is obviously a really important topic. As an introduction, I'm going to say most of this presentation is going to focus on management. Overall, I think our focus when it comes to calf disease should be on management. There are certainly specific products out there and vaccines that may help us avoid diseases in dairy calves. But most of the diseases that we deal with in the industry, whether it's diarrhea, whether it's pneumonia, whether it's umbilical problems, usually deal from or stem from improper calf management and or poor facilities. I would say if you have poor facilities, if you have failure of passive transfer problems or things like that on any significant basis, there's not a magic bullet or a magic product out there that's going to solve your problem. So we're going to come at this presentation today mostly from a management standpoint. In this country, we still got a fairly significant mortality rate or death rate in pre-weaned dairy heifers. The last study that was done by the United States Department of Agriculture showed about 8% of dairy heifers died before weaning. That's not including another 6 to 7% stillbirth rate. The study showed only about 40% of farms were able to produce enough heifers to serve their needs. And really, there's not major diseases. If you look at the swine industry, they've had several outbreaks in the last 10 years of new diseases, where our diseases in the dairy industry are really the same. Diarrhea, pneumonia, septicemia, umbilical infections. Those have been around for 100 years, and really we're doing some better in terms of preventing and treating these diseases, but these are still our major issues that we deal with. Many farms, even though we've stressed through these webinars and articles, etc., how important colostrum management is, many farms, according to these surveys, are still not doing a very good job. This is some data from the National Animal Health Monitoring Surveys, or the big, quote, dairy studies that they've done over the last 20 to 25 to 30 years. If you look, here's data from, see if I can get the pointer to work here, from 1991 all the way. This is the big study that just finished last year, and these data are preliminary here. But if you look at these data across 30 years, again, calf mortality is anywhere from 7 to 10%. About 55 to 60% of calf deaths are caused by diarrhea. About 20 to 25% are caused by pneumonia. So again, there's not new major diseases that we're dealing with. These are the same diseases that we've had for a long time. Goals. So I'd like to start the presentation by talking about what your goals should be. I would say definitely if you're losing more than 4% of your calves prior to weaning, and by calf death loss prior to weaning, I would include all calves that are still alive at 24 hours of age. Generally, if a calf is dead in the first 24 hours of age, I would call that an abortion or a stillbirth or some kind of congenital problem. But generally, if a calf survives to 24 hours of age and then dies prior to 7 or 8 weeks of age, I would call that a pre-weaning mortality. And if you're over 4%, there's definitely room for improvement. You should look at your operation, at your management, at your facilities, and see where improvements can be made. A really good dairy will get that number down to 2%. I think it's very hard to get that number much lower than 2%. I've seen it lower than 2%, but not consistently on farms. So if you're in the 2 to 2.5% range, I would say you're doing an excellent job. More than 4%, and again, the national average right now is 7.5%, but there's room for improvement on those farms. Treatment rates should be less than 25%. I would say if you're treating more than 20 to 25% of your calves for any one disease, whether that's diarrhea, whether that's pneumonia, there's opportunities to work with your veterinarian and try to improve that, okay? I like to use calf records when possible to help identify problems. I'm not going to go into detail today about keeping calf records, but these are important for the veterinarian to help you troubleshoot your problems, whether they're colostrum problems, whether they relate to when the animals break with disease, what treatments seem to be working on your farm, etc. So control of disease. These are 4 key principles that were outlined almost 50 years ago now by one of the fathers of modern veterinary medicine, a guy named Otto Radistitz, who was from Canada. And these are still very true today, and these are sort of how I'm going to base the rest of this presentation. He came up with the key principles of disease control, and if you think about it, really this is all we can try to do in the dairy industry, particularly with calf health, to keep these calves safe. One of the things we can do is try to remove the source of infection from the calf's environment, okay? Try to keep their environment that they're raised in as clean as possible. Number 2, we can try to remove a calf from a contaminated environment. Think of the calving pen or the calving situation. We know that's a dirty environment. We want to get the calf out of that environment as soon as we can. 3, we try to increase the immunity of the calf, and then we can try to reduce stress. And we'll talk about all of these things in a little bit more detail. But outside of that, there's not much we can do to try to prevent disease in these animals. Really, this is all we can do. So colostrum management, there's been webinars on colostrum. There's much more detail than I'm going to go through in this presentation. But this is something that's critically important. Probably the one thing I would encourage most producers to look at if you're having calf health issues is have your veterinarian look at your colostrum management program, test some calves. You can do blood tests very simply and see if your calves have an adequate concentration of antibodies, okay? Ensuring that all calves get enough colostrum in the first 2 to 4 hours of life or as quickly as possible after birth is probably the most important aspect of raising calves. If we have a good colostrum management program, you can get away with some other things. You can get away with some outdated facilities sometimes. But if you have poor colostrum management, even if everything else is very good, you will continue to have disease issues in these calves. Briefly, some keys to success with colostrum management: the time of feeding. We know the sooner we can get the colostrum into the calf, the better that will be. So obviously some dairies are small, people go to bed at night. It can't always happen in 2 to 4 hours, but if you find a calf has been born overnight, that becomes your immediate priority for the day, not after the cows are milked, not after the cows are fed. Right away, that calf needs to be fed colostrum. Volume, at least 3, if not 4 liters to every calf. Clean colostrum, what we've shown is bacteria will hinder antibody absorption. So if we have colostrum with a lot of antibodies, if there's also a lot of bacteria, you won't get good absorption. So we need clean colostrum. We need to harvest it from a clean udder. We recommend not to pool colostrum or mix it from multiple cows. That's a good way to transmit diseases and usually will overemphasize poor quality colostrum and lead to more problems with failure of passive transfer. We recommend testing calves, if not always, at least periodically, to make sure this is going well. By testing calves, all we need to do is take a blood sample, spin it down, and check total protein on a regular refractometer, or you can also use a Brix refractometer. Have some colostrum storage, even if you're using fresh colostrum or refrigerated colostrum from all your calves. Just make sure you have a backup supply in case you need it, whether that's colostrum replacer or whether that's frozen colostrum. You need to make sure you have some available. And again, make this a priority. On large dairies, I like to sort of appoint somebody that this is their main job. Obviously, can't be their only job, but this is their responsibility. But make this a priority in your herd. Okay. Other control points that I would be very interested in looking at from a avoiding disease in calf standpoint is the maternity area. So a lot of times calves get exposed to disease from their dam or from other cattle, adult cattle, in the maternity area right at birth. We must minimize contamination of this calving area, whether it's a pasture, whether it's a pen. We need to make sure it's clean, provide good bedding material, remove the calf promptly after birth. As a rule of thumb, this is not always true, but generally if I'm dealing with calves that are a week of age or less that get sick, I usually think that that's coming from the maternity area. I try to look at the maternity area to see if I can find disease. If calves are older than a week of age, then it tends to be the calf housing area, the hutches, or the barns. Colostrum, we talked about the good points of colostrum, but the colostrum can also be a source of disease transmission at times. It's been shown to be a source of salmonella transmission. Also, pooling increases the risk of transmission for things like Johne's disease. So again, we want to make sure our colostrum management is optimal. We want to make sure colostrum is cooled rapidly after we collect it. And either, if it's going to be refrigerated for more than 24 hours, I would prefer you go ahead and just freeze it. And when we do have times where we have salmonella problems or we have some other issue with poor quality colostrum, we may want to consider pasteurizing it or using a colostrum replacer for a little while. So colostrum management is really important, but we have to make sure we're not transmitting disease when we feed colostrum as well. Housing, we want to make sure with whether it's a barn, whether it's a hutch outside, we're making sure we're housing calves in a clean, dry environment with very good drainage. The key here really is to make sure we're not exposing calves to manure from adult cows for that first 8-week period. There are a lot of pathogens in there that don't cause disease for the cow, but will cause disease for the calf, okay? If you're using hutches, we want to make sure we're moving hutches to clean areas between calves. And group housing systems, we want to make sure we're not overcrowding, keep our groups small, make sure calves are of similar ages, okay? We're trying to minimize temperature stress. Obviously, that's easier said than done sometimes, but that's another component of housing. Here's an example of a situation I saw. This was on a large dairy in Mexico. This dairy had a salmonella problem. You can see the manure separator system is right here, and the calves go all the way around the manure separator system. We could culture salmonella from the sand all the way up to 100 yards away from this. So this is a bacteria that's going into the air and it's settling into the environment where their calves are living in. So again, we need to pay attention to where the calves are housed. Are they exposed to manure in any way from the adult cattle? This was a problem that had been ongoing for years and never got better until we moved the calves to a totally different area of the farm. Calf density, okay? We want calves to have at least, ideally, 4 square meters per calf, 3 to 4. Calf-to-calf contact increases the risk of pathogen exposure, so that doesn't mean we can't house calves as groups, but certainly we need to make sure they have adequate space. Giving them enough distance is important. So here are some various ways to house calves. Here we see hutches. Down here we see group housing, a group housing situation down here. Here's pens. These are all examples of what I would consider to be overcrowding, okay? As a rule, if you have hutches, there should be at least the width of the hutch in between other hutches. The purpose of the hutch is to raise these calves in isolation, okay? So if one calf gets disease, the next calf doesn't automatically get exposed to the same pathogen. Here was a farm. This was in the state of Pennsylvania. I actually saw this calf that was in this hutch have diarrhea not hit his neighbor, but actually the third calf over. It had diarrhea and splattered right in his face. Okay, so here this producer is keeping the calves out of the wind. He's packing them together, trying to avoid wind stress or environment stress. But really, once one of these calves gets sick, they're all going to get sick because they're too close together. So all these are examples of not improper housing, but calves that have too high of stocking density, or they're overcrowded and they're really predisposed to developing disease. In contrast, these are different housing examples. Doesn't mean these are ideal or not ideal, but these are different examples that I've seen in various parts of the world that I would consider much better from a housing density. These hutches are spread apart. They don't have to necessarily be spread out this far, but again, at least the width of the hutch. Okay, here's a calf inside. He's got solid sides. He has no contact with his neighbor. These are calves that are spread out appropriately. Ventilation, okay, particularly as we get into the Midwest or the northern states where calf barns are more common than calf hutches, we have to pay attention to ventilation. In these areas, pneumonia can become one of our biggest killers of dairy calves. Studies have linked respiratory disease or pneumonia in dairy calves primarily to poorly ventilated housing. It's important to realize that there's microenvironments within calf barns. What does that mean? That means the air might smell really good when you walk in, but it might be of very poor quality at the level of the calf's nose. Okay, there can be big differences between low down or 2 feet off the ground where the calf lives and 5 to 6 feet off the ground where we live. We need to look at air quality at the calf's level. Some of the key factors for improving ventilation or reducing pneumonia are having straw in the barns for the calves to nest, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a few slides. Making sure that if you do group house, there's solid panels between calves so there's no nose-to-nose contact, and low airborne bacterial counts in calf pens. Okay, so again, I'll go through a series of pictures here to sort of illustrate ventilation. These are calves in the southeast. These are calves in hutches. Most of our calves in the southeast are in hutches, outside, spread apart. Probably it doesn't get any better than this in terms of ventilation. We can house calves in barns. Here's an example of a large barn. It's got a ridge vent, so your old stale air is going to go out. Okay, lots of air is going to blow through these open-sided pens. Okay, this is good ventilation. However, it's been shown that if we have solid sides, we actually decrease the risk of pneumonia in these calves. Okay, so here we have better ventilation. By putting in solid sides, I actually reduce the ventilation, and I may have higher bacterial counts in the air, but the level of, or the cases of pneumonia go down. Why? Because these calves don't have nose-to-nose contact with their neighbors. So if you're going to have calves in barns, it's ideal to have solid sides, but open front and back so air can flow through these facilities. Where we see a lot of respiratory disease is in old swine barns or old poultry barns that then get converted into dairy calf housing. Okay, particularly in the wintertime, people close the curtains. Here we see curtains get closed and air quality gets really bad. Bacterial counts in the air will be very high. This is not just a Midwest phenomenon. Here you see example of something similar in North Carolina. This is near Greensboro, North Carolina. This is an old swine barn that's been converted into housing dairy calves. They're inside in the wintertime. They've got the curtains closed, not only for the calves' comfort, but for their comfort. And these calves have a lot of respiratory disease now. We talked about nesting score earlier. From University of Wisconsin data, they've shown that it was important to bed these calves deeply in straw and then leave the side curtains either fully open or partially open. So you're going to have a 40-degree barn, but if you can bed these calves, they can actually insulate themselves very well in straw. So what they did was they looked at something they called nesting score, meaning how deeply the calf was buried in the straw. And the goal is that the calf is buried deep enough that you can't see their legs. If they're down there and you can't see the calf's legs, they're going to get very good protection against the cold, and then we can go ahead and leave the curtains open to provide better ventilation to that barn. So ventilation is really, really important when we think about preventing pneumonia. Here's a group housing situation. These are calves on automatic feeders in North Carolina and housed in groups. Keys here again would be just to keep your group small, no more than 20 calves per group, and make sure they have adequate space and that there's good ventilation in the barn. Here's an example of, again, calves on automatic feeders in North Carolina. They have good ventilation, they're outside, but these calves are really overcrowded. And because they're overcrowded, they have a significant respiratory disease or pneumonia incidence in this herd as well. So, you know, managing these calves, managing facilities is really, really critical to avoiding disease. Nutrition is really important. There's a lot of work recently showing that if we maintain calves on higher planes of nutrition, if we feed them better, that they will be more resistant to disease. There was a recent study from Cornell with cryptosporidiosis where calves fed a higher plane of nutrition diet actually stopped shedding crypto faster and had fewer days of diarrhea as compared to calves on just a conventional gallon a day of 20% protein milk replacer. So we're learning more and more about how important nutrition is to these calves and keeping them healthy. Minimize use of things like calf warmers, trailers for transporting calves. It's not that we can't use these things, but they rarely get cleaned and they tend to have high pathogen loads. If you have a farm that has salmonella, it will tend to be in these calf warmers or other facilities where every calf passes through. Make sure we clean our hutches and turn them upside down after every use. Make sure we're removing manure fairly frequently. Cleaning bedding material, cleaning buckets, cleaning bottles, that's all very important, okay? Some farms never clean their buckets. This is, ideally, we should be doing it every day, at least a couple times a week. This is a dairy that I used to go to. It actually doesn't exist anymore, but they had immaculate cleanliness, okay? So every bottle after every feeding was brushed, washed, hung up to dry. This was actually a prison dairy. They paid inmates 25 cents an hour to wash bottles. I know, you know, most of our dairies don't have that ability. Nobody's favorite job is to clean buckets or bottles, but this is another area that's really important to avoiding disease, is to make sure we're cleaning between animals. And then lastly, in terms of control stress, lots of different things can cause stress in the life of a dairy calf. Changing the diet, moving those animals, weather, whether that's cold or heat, varying variations in feeding schedule, weaning, all those things have been shown to increase disease. There's a lot of new science coming out that shows, certainly in swine, in the turkey chicken industry, they actually can have things like salmonella or O157H7 E. coli living in their intestines, and then stress stimulates growth or shedding of those organisms, okay? What they're showing is that the bacteria can actually detect changes in stress hormone, norepinephrine concentrations. They can live sort of dormantly in your gut for a while, and when that calf or when that pig becomes stressed, they start multiplying and cause disease. So preventing stress in the calf's life as much as possible is really important as well. So just to summarize the control points, make sure our colostrum management is in good shape, have a clean maternity area, try to remove the calf as quickly as we can after calving, make sure I have good nutrition. If you're still feeding just a gallon of 20% protein milk replacer, you're probably behind the times, okay? There's lots of data that shows calves will grow better, calves will be healthier on higher protein or higher planes of nutrition. Appropriate housing, you know, I don't know that there's hutches or barns or any one type is ideal. All types will work, but we need to make sure that we're raising calves that are not too crowded and making sure we have good ventilation. Minimize manure contact between calves and older cattle, sanitize feeding equipment, and then avoid stress in these animals as much as we can. Other risk factors are going to be climate, availability of water. Calves should always have water available, even right from birth. They may not drink very much, but they'll sort of play in it and get used to it. As they become a couple weeks of age, it's really, really critical that they have water. Erratic feeding schedules can be a risk factor for disease as well as bacterial contamination of milk and milk replacer. And then lastly, I'm not going to talk a lot about treating disease, but I would say the keys here are learn to identify sick calves early, both with diarrhea and pneumonia. They're going to respond much better to treatment if we catch them early in the course of disease. So I don't want to catch the calf with diarrhea that's down and can't get up. I want to catch the calf with diarrhea that's mildly dehydrated and will respond very well to oral electrolytes, okay? I don't want to catch the calf with severe pneumonia. I want to catch the calf very early before it has obvious signs of respiratory disease, okay? Second, I want to make sure that I have appropriate treatment protocols in place. Work with your veterinarian. The goal is that you have a written treatment protocol in place for the major diseases that you have on your farm, certainly diarrhea, certainly pneumonia, making sure that no matter who's working on the day when the calf gets sick, that the calf gets treated appropriately, okay? We also want to monitor response to these treatments regularly, make sure your protocols work. If you're giving NAC-Silk every day or every time a calf gets pneumonia and that doesn't seem to be working, we may need to reevaluate that protocol. But we shouldn't just change drugs on a daily basis when the calf is not responding. So again, in conclusion, their overall focus should be on management, not specifically products or interventions. Calf disease is mostly related to facilities, to nutrition, to colostrum management. The vast majority of diseases and calf health problems stem from some sort of management-related disease, okay? Here, down in the corner, we see an example of this. If I can get the pointer to work. I'm embarrassed to say this is a heifer on a farm in North Carolina. This heifer is about 8 months old and still in the hutch, hasn't been weaned. We've got some serious management issues on this farm that we have to address. So, you know, there isn't a magic vaccination that's going to fix this problem. There's other things that we need to deal with from a management standpoint to make sure we are able to avoid disease in dairy calves, okay? So with that, I hope there's some questions from the group that we can answer. I'd be happy to answer questions about anything dealing with calf health or avoiding disease in dairy calves.
All right, thank you, Dr. Smith. I just want to point out there are some web links that Jeff has provided that I think would give you a lot of good information, some of the work done at the University of Wisconsin and other materials that are on the E-Extension Dairy XNet website. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box. In the meantime, Jeff, in your neck of the woods, you know, you're certainly a lot warmer than we are up here in Pennsylvania. In terms of ventilation and things, what are people doing with these calf hutches in the summer?
We probably actually have, obviously we have more issues with heat stress here than we do with winter cold stress. So, you know, you sort of think the hutch provides shade in the summertime, but we've actually measured temperatures and it's like a little oven. You know, it's funny when it's 90 degrees or 95 degrees, the students will always ask, why are the calves laying outside and not in the hutch? Well, it's actually cooler outside than it is in some of the hutches. One thing that helps is obviously to try to put them under shade or put shade cloth above them. Another thing that helps is to put a concrete block under the back. There was actually, that sounds fairly simple, but there was a paper in Journal of Dairy Science not too long ago that showed that actually tremendously improved ventilation just by putting a block underneath. So our dairies that have hutches stick with hutches year round, but they will have significant heat stress issues in the summertime.
Yeah.
I haven't been to a farm that gets into like water or evaporative cooling of calves, but mainly trying to get shade over them and, you know, under a cluster of trees or something like that is what they do. Sometimes there's fan systems around the calves that push some air on some of the bigger farms. But that's really what is done mainly in this area to try to avoid heat stress.
We have one question from Richard asking relative to your opinion on housing practices for pre-weaned calves. Do you prefer individual hutches or group housing?
I don't know that I have a solid preference. For a long time, I would have said calf hutches. I think there's advantages of calf hutches and being able to raise that calf in isolation and minimize disease. However, as automated feeders have become more and more common, I have some dairies that do a very good job with group housing now. I think you can do both types of housing well. I've seen farms that spent thousands of dollars on hutches and had them lined up in long rows touching each other, and that's really defeating the purpose of that system. So you can do hutches well, you can do hutches poorly. I think group housing can be done. I think hutches probably always have some advantage, but I really think in terms of automated feeders and ability to feed calves multiple times per day, I think that's probably will be the way we go in the future. So I think group housing is, I think, something that we need to spend some time figuring out how to do well, because there are multiple advantages to group housing over individual hutches in terms of managing those calves together.
And I think, as you said earlier, the nutrition is such an important factor in building up the immune response and this calf's ability to fend off, any of the pathogen insults that they can get exposed to.
Yes, sir.
Another question here. What about feeding? Is once, twice, or 3 times a day appropriate? What's better?
There is some data. I don't know that it's published yet, but there is data that indicated 3 times a day was significantly better than twice a day. If you look at a beef calf, they will nurse 4 to 6 to even 7, 8 times a day sometimes. I guess personally, I don't see why a dairy calf would be any different. I think small meals more frequently is good. Once a day feeding is actually still relatively popular here in North Carolina. I'm not a fan of it. I see a lot of GI health issues in those calves that are fed 4 to 6 quarts once a day. I think that's too much. Twice a day feeding has been conventional in the dairy industry for years, but I think as we feed calves more frequently, I think there's some advantage to that. One of the things we know is that abomasal emptying, or the amount of time the milk sits in the stomach, is controlled significantly by volume. So the more volume we feed the calves, the longer it's going to sit in the stomach. That's going to lead to things like clostridial bloat, okay, because you have a very energy-dense liquid sitting in the stomach. You have bacteria there that produce gas, and we get increased rates of disease. So I think feeding smaller volumes more frequently is going to be better. A lot of my dairymen will feed twice a day, and I encourage them to feed 3 times a day, and they just can't get it done from a labor standpoint. I think probably any more than 3 times a day is impractical without going to something like an automated calf feeder. But I do think there is advantages to feeding smaller volumes more frequently.
Now, you also mentioned needing or desiring to identify sick calves early. Any protocols or systems out there that you could highlight that might help people to implement some kind of system where they can identify sick cows a little more quickly?
Sure. It's going to depend a little bit on what your major disease is. If it's pneumonia, there's a very good system that's been designed by the folks at University of Wisconsin. There's a respiratory disease scoring system. If you'll click on that early identification of sick calves link, it'll go through that. But basically, the scoring system that's been developed, you're supposed to do it on all your calves at least twice a week. But basically, it's based on the rectal temperature. There's a score based on whether the calf is coughing or not. There's a score based on what their eyes look like, whether there's any discharge from the eyes. And you come up with a total score, and it'll tell you whether or not that calf needs treatment. And with this system, you can really identify some of these calves much earlier than you would have if you're just sort of looking to see that they're breathing hard or they're coughing. If it's diarrhea, what I really encourage people to do is, every time you feed the calf, take a look at it. Don't just put the milk in the bucket and walk by. That calf should immediately get up and come It should want to drink its milk. If you see the calf just lay there or is really slow to get up, that's a calf that I would, take a step back and look at. Are its eyes sunken? Does it have diarrhea? But just trying to pay closer attention to these calves. There are certainly dehydration scoring systems and diarrhea scoring systems, but most of us can pick up a calf with early diarrhea if we take the time to look at it. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't look at these calves until, an hour later and they realize the calf never got up to drink at all. So, I use attitude as an indicator a lot of the times. If that calf doesn't jump up immediately or isn't already waiting there for its milk, usually that's an indication that I probably need to take a second look or a closer look at that calf.
Yeah, that scoring system of the University of Wisconsin, I think, has been a very useful system.
It has.
And I think UC Davis has developed or refined that system just a little bit more, and that information is also on the DairyXnet website. And with that, I'll thank everybody for joining us today. Enjoy your day, and we'll sign off now. Thank you.